A woman named Stacey Abrams gave the Democratic rebuttal to the State of the Union address last night. Abrams is not an office holder. She's a former state legislator from Georgia. She lost the governor's race there in the last election. Nevertheless, party leaders clearly have big plans for Abrams. Her speech last night wasn't much. She talked mostly about herself. But far more interesting is a piece that Abrams wrote in this month's Foreign Affairs magazine. The piece is called "Identity Politics Strengthens Democracy." And if you want to understand what the Democratic Party seeks for this country, you ought to read the piece. Abrams went to Yale Law School, so the article itself was a chore to get through. It's written in that cloying, indirect academic style that passes for erudition among our credentialed elites. Lots of meaningless adjectives, very few declarative sentences. But you'll get the point anyway. It's crystal clear. Quote, "By embracing identity," Abrams writes in the final sentence, "Americans will become more likely to grow as one." So ponder that for a second. The less we have in common, the more united we will be. Is that true? Well, of course not. It's absurd. Even Stacey Abrams doesn't really believe it. Nobody does. Abrams doesn't even bother to defend that premise, much less explain how exactly identity politics will unite this country. Unity is definitely not what Stacey Abrams is interested in, just the opposite. What she's selling is bitter division. Abrams spends the bulk of the piece calling on what she describes as the marginalized to unite against the, quote, dominant groups. So who is marginalized and who is dominant? That's not a small question. In the scheme of identity politics, it's the only question that matters. Everything rides on who's the victim and who's the oppressor. That's the entire equation. And Abrams spells out the answer in very clear language. The marginalized, she writes, include, quote, women, Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants, and the LGBTQ community. The dominant are everyone who's left. So do the subtraction. That's only one group. You know exactly who they are, and so does Stacey Abrams. She says these people, these unnamed people, are responsible for the suffering of everyone else, and we need to overthrow them. She uses the language of violence and war to describe what must come next. Quote, "Politics is the most effective method of revolt." Revolt. People get hurt in revolts. That's the nature of revolts. Stacey Abrams knows that. She wants one anyway. She doesn't hide it. Demagoguery like this would make a certain kind of sense if your only interest was in winning elections and you didn't care about what happened afterward. That's where Democrats are right now. The Democratic Party is a highly unstable collection of interest groups, many of them with radically different interests and goals. It's not a natural coalition. There's no reason all of these groups should be voting for the same candidates in every election. The only way to keep a fractious group like this together is by inventing a common enemy that everyone can oppose. You're one of us if you hate these people. Now, this often works in the short term. It worked for Democrats in the Jim Crow South for about 100 years, and that's why they still do it. The problem is that these people, these dominant groups, as Stacey Abrams says, aren't some foreign invader from a faraway land. They're your countrymen. You're not supposed to hate them or hurt them or revolt against them. They is us. We're in this together. We're all Americans. That's the most important thing, really the only important thing. Stacey Abrams doesn't see it that way. Neither do the leaders of her party. They think they can win the next election by telling Americans they must hate their neighbors for the color of their skin. It's possible this will work one more time. But then what happens after the election? Abrams doesn't answer that question in her piece. She doesn't care. But the rest of us should think about it. No election is worth the hatred and the division of identity politics, not if you plan to live here anyway.